right, everybody, welcome back to the Deep Life. And today we are very excited for our guest, Greg Schmaus, who joins us. Welcome, Greg, to the Deep Life podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I've been following you guys' work for a while, and I'm just very grateful to share this space with you in this conversation.
Oh, we are so excited. And yes, I can't remember how we began following you. I think it was probably a correlation with the Czech Institute and when Dan was getting his level 1 certification, and the wealth of knowledge that you bring and your raw truth, which can be really hard in the social media space. We're just so grateful for it because people need to hear it. And we're really excited to dive deep into all holistic health things today. But for our listeners who may be unfamiliar with who you are, could you give a little background of, how you became the Greg that you are today and what brought you to this point?
So I was born and raised in New Jersey, and I was very athletic growing up. I was always a very quiet kid. So initially my body was how I expressed myself. That was kind of like my vehicle for self-expression. And that led me at the age of 16, I went to a golf and tennis academy. I wanted to play professional golf. That was like my dream, my passion. And as life usually has it, life had something different in store for me. So during my freshman year of college, I experienced a physical trauma. I had surgery. And as I was coming out of anesthesia, I started experiencing a lot of anxiety, a lot of OCD, a lot of kind of like mental, emotional turmoil, started having a lot of like gut issues. So it was kind of like my initiation into my own healing journey. And that was really kind of, from my perspective, like my soul directing me on my path, which is, as a healer, as a practitioner, a lot of times your work is facilitated by your own personal journey. Like you have to kind of make the fire walk first before you can support anyone else in coaching them or supporting them. So that was really what introduced me to the work of Paul Chek and the Czech Institute. I became a client of Paul's for many years. And I've studied with the Czech Institute for, I think, almost 8 years now. And I've studied with a wide variety of, modalities and, massage and body work and energy work. But the Czech Institute has always been kind of like my home base because, Paul was my teacher and mentor through my journey. And, that's really what brought me here today.
Oh, so when you say here today, like what is your coaching practice like now?
So I started out, this is about 10 years ago, I started out much more like in the physical realm, doing a lot of the corrective exercise and the orthopedic like rehabilitation. So working with a lot of chronic pain and even doing a lot of like personal training. And it slowly evolved into a lot more like nutrition and lifestyle coaching, then evolved more into kind of the mental, emotional, spiritual work. So I used to do a lot of in-person work, a lot of physical work, and probably COVID, I would say, expedited that process a lot in terms of my own transition into really focusing on more like mental, emotional healing. Yeah. So I would say it's probably like 70-30, like remote coaching to in-person coaching, and 70-30, mental, emotional work to physical work. Not that you can really separate any of it. I might have a client that comes in with lower back pain, and if we get down to the root of it, it might be something more mental, emotional. So you can't really compartmentalize it as much as we thought we could in the past. But that's kind of really where I'm at now in my work.
Yeah, I love it. And I think Dan and I resonate so much with it because it's exactly really what we're going through right now. When we started the company Momentum, Dan pioneered it as a personal trainer. And then, I just, full transparency, I've mentioned this on the podcast. I had a severe eating disorder for nearly 12 years and I overcame it. I mean, it's still something that I work through every day, obviously, it's something that stays with me, but I very much found a passion in eating healthy and being able to treat my body with the foods that I put in it as, medicine. So I became a nutrition coach. But then with healing ourselves, we were like, oh my gosh, there's so much deeper rooted traumatic experiences that, I mean, yes, Dan can get you in the best shape possible, and I can give you all of the tips and tricks to, live a healthy lifestyle with the food that you're putting in your body. But if you're not getting down deep into those root causes of what the suffering is in your, soul, there's only so much we can do. So we're transitioning that too into what we bring to our clients. So we hear you on that, and we thank you for the work that you're doing there.
Yeah, I mean, every choice that we make is based on a belief system, right?
Yeah.
So if all of our behaviors are based on choices, all choices are based on belief systems, any behavior that's carried out through the physical body is rooted in some belief system in the psyche. That's why, for example, like I love working with archetypes. Archetypes are kind of the language of the psyche that we all use as vehicles of self-expression and relationship. So for me, like exploring archetypes is kind of like the root of all of that, which is why a lot of my work is kind of like more tailored kind of down that road in terms of, like Caroline Miss's work, sacred contracts, the survival archetypes, all of that to me is like the root of everything that we see kind of manifesting in the body.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
It really is. Yeah.
I think like something I see with just disease in general, I feel like we're kind of going down this path. So I don't want to waste this opportunity. We need to get into some mental health things. But what I see a lot is maybe different, like what we label as diseases manifesting differently, or different diseases manifesting from the same root cause. So you have maybe a family where people say like, oh, something runs in my family, but so like they have a specific lifestyle. People are probably eating the same, doing a lot of things, a lot of, like you said, the same belief structures. But then maybe one person will develop arthritis, and another will develop dementia, and another diabetes. But we have all these different paths and different routes, but it can come back to maybe like a simpler concept of what's causing it. And I just wanted to ask you, like, do you see kind of the same thing with mental health, where maybe the same lifestyle, the same belief structure with one person will manifest as ADHD, with another person maybe anxiety or depression or anything down that route?
Yeah, what I would say is a lot of it is rooted in the environment. So, if you study like genetics and epigenetics, like it's really the environment that kind of like triggers what genes get turned on or turned off. So when it comes to mental health, there's a couple things. I think all mental health challenges are very much like patterns of adaptation. Like I think like ADHD, for example, a classic pattern of adaptation is take a child that doesn't feel safe in their environment. They're always going to be kind of like scanning their environments, needing to be like hyper vigilant, aware of any potential threats. So that ADHD of like, I can't focus on one thing. Well, it's because there might be something that you miss out on that could be a threat to you, right? It could be an abusive parent. It could be something with a sibling, right? So the ADHD is actually a way that the child adapts to circumstances in the environment. But there's kind of like the pattern of what once served you and kept you safe eventually holds you back from being free, right? So that's an example of it's a pattern of adaptation. Another thing, I think it was Carl Jung who said, all mental illness is the avoidance of a deeper suffering.
Yes.
Where
Oh, I want to dive into
like
that.
Anxiety, OCD, like all of these things, one thing I've shared with a lot of clients and, some of the people that follow my work is I would ask like this question, like, is anxiety actually a feeling, for example? A lot of people say, I feel really anxious. And I'm like, are you sure you're actually feeling anxious and anxiety is actually a feeling? Or is anxiety the avoidance of feeling, right? Is anxiety the experience of there's something inside of me that's rising up that I don't want to feel? So the anxiety is like my attempt to escape myself. But, you know, the old saying, wherever you go, there you are. So in reality, anxiety, for example, is the avoidance of something deeper. It might be fear, it might be shame, it might be guilt, it might be grief. There's some emotion that feels uncomfortable. And remember, feeling emotions in your body is a lot more vulnerable and uncomfortable than thinking thoughts in your mind. So a lot of times we use the mind to avoid the body, right? We use thinking to avoid feeling, because thinking, it's kind of like easier to live from the neck up than to actually feel the somatic experience of life and emotion and experience and sensation. Like sometimes that's way more vulnerable, especially coming back to environments. If you grew up in an environment that wasn't a safe container for you to process challenging emotions, right? This is where like I love Gabor Mate's work on like trauma and addiction, where he talks a lot about like your upbringing and whether it was safe or not for you to actually process uncomfortable feelings. And if that wasn't kind of like set as a foundation, then you're going to spend your whole life trying to avoid those levels of vulnerability. You're going to spend your whole life trying to bypass whatever those feelings are. It might be with anxiety, mental illness, it might be with an addiction. But I think those are kind of like the key components of where a lot of that is kind of derived from.
Yeah, you said that so beautifully and broke it down really, really, really well.
Yeah, and I think it's a kind of almost important to mention that they don't have to be like it doesn't have to be a big trauma.
No.
Where you say that just feeling unsafe to experience emotions can be really subtle. And I think that people will almost like judge themselves for that too, where it's like, my trauma wasn't bad enough, so why do I feel guilt or shame, or why am I upset?
Yeah, and the trauma is not necessarily, and Gabor talks a lot about this, it's not what happened to you, it's what you perceived. Right? For example, like I remember when I was competing in golf when I was younger, my mom or dad would usually walk the course with me, like, and they would, you know, walk on the side and sometimes keep score, just kind of like follow along for like the 18 holes. And my mom would always stay for the whole 18 holes, which my belief system as a child was like, oh, mom is always there. My dad, when he would travel with me to tournaments, anytime I wasn't playing well, I noticed my dad would leave. Right? So I stopped playing well, my dad wasn't there anymore. And then I would finish the 18 holes and I would see him waiting in the clubhouse. So without inquiring about it, I developed this belief system, this perception that when I don't perform at my best, my father abandons me.
Wow, yeah.
Right? So that triggers anxiety, that triggers a lot of self-judgment, that triggers the perfectionist, right? So a lot of adaptation from that. But then years later, I inquire about it, and my dad basically shares with me, I thought that if you weren't playing at your best, that you wouldn't want me there.
Wow. Oh, wow.
So he almost empathically was doing what he thought I would feel most comfortable with, which was, we could say, a trauma, but it was totally based on perception of what happened, not what actually happened. Right?
Yeah.
Oh my God. Yeah.
So
Thank you for sharing that story.
Less about what happened to you and more, just very simply how you perceived it, or what the narrative is that you created out of it. There's always a narrative that we create.
Yeah. And then at least I know, like in my personal experience, when we have that narrative, there's a tendency to like dwell on and almost like spiral into this feeling where you're just going to keep repeating it, and also like looking for other examples that validate that feeling.
Yep.
Yeah.
Or you'll do whatever you can to avoid that feeling. Right? If it's like abandonment, it's like, okay, I need to do whatever I possibly can to avoid the experience of abandonment. And unfortunately, that usually results in abandoning yourself.
Yes,
right?
It definitely does. Yeah, I want to get back into the anxiety a little bit
Sure.
and stress kind of, because this resonates with me a lot. I suffered, I guess you would say, or with anxious feelings for the majority of, I'd say, like probably starting in college was when it hit really, really bad. And it's definitely runs in my family. My mother's a very anxious person, my aunts and cousins, like it was talked about over the dinner table, like everybody just had anxiety. It's normal.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember it was so severe in college. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, your heart racing, you feel like you're going to throw up, you're in, cold sweats. And the only thing that my mother ever told me that helped her was to distract yourself, to get
Mm-hmm.
out of that sense. She's like, call me at whatever hour. And I would just call her and then we would randomly talk.
Mm-hmm.
But I just noticed the anxiety did not go away. It kept coming back week after week after week. And I love that you say it was really my avoidance of the feelings that needed to come up and basically release themselves, because feelings are energy. But I didn't know that, and I was suppressing it so much.
Yeah.
Do you have, I mean, I have my own techniques on how to release this when these come up, but what is it, something that you tell people or you share with people or even clients that, like, if they're in that heightened space of observing themselves feeling anxiety, how do you direct them?
A couple of things. The first is, a lot of the reason we avoid feeling something is because of the storyline or the label we've attached to it, right? We're all taught that, like, happiness, joy, gratitude, these are all like positive emotions.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And then fear, shame, anger, sadness, grief, these are all negative emotions. So from a very young age, we attach to all the positive ones and do whatever we can to experience those and try and hold on to them and like bottle them up. And then we try and disassociate from all the ones that we've been taught are negative.
Yeah.
So one thing that I invite people to do is to drop the story or the label that they've attached to an emotion as this is a good one, this is a bad one, this is right, this is wrong, and actually just allow yourself to feel the somatic experience of that energy. And when you do that, you realize that, oh, this isn't so bad. Like, it's just energy in my body, right? It might be a heaviness in my chest. It might be, my belly turning a little bit. It might be sweaty in my palm. Like, there's just this sensation in the body. So I just invite people to get more curious about the bodily experience than all of the narratives and storylines about what the emotion is about.
Yeah.
Because 95% of the time, whatever rises up in you, there's nothing that you're supposed to do about it. It's just a process that's happening. And your only job is just to be present with it and allow it to pass through. So that's the first thing, is just like drop the story, drop the label, and drop into your body. The second thing is, if you think about anxiety as kind of like the air element, right? Think about like the air element is kind of like the feeling of when, the wind's just blowing you around. You're like a kite with no tail. And what we're experiencing is like the lack of feeling grounded, which is the earth element.
Mm-hmm.
So I like almost using a form of alchemy, using the elements of earth, air, water, and fire, which is anxiety is too much air, not enough earth, right? You could say anger would be too much fire, not enough water, right? So all of these emotions are very elemental.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very almost like shamanic to be able to use alchemy to rebalance yourself. For example, someone who's anxious, too much air, not enough earth, I might tell them, instead of sitting in a chair or laying in your bed, go lay on the floor, right? Or just go outside, take your shoes off and get barefoot on the earth, maybe sit under a tree. right? So any way that
Mhm.
we could actually bring the earth elements back in, a lot of times helps rebalance those people's energy, right?
I
If
love
it's,
That makes
that.
so much sense.
Yes.
yeah, if it's too much anger, like too much fire, it might be go take a cold shower, go
Yeah.
take an Epsom salt bath,
Mhm.
right? Or if it's someone who's very depressed, it might be too much water where they're very stagnant. They might need more fire. So it's like, hey, go lift some weights or go in a sauna,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
And just get a nice deep sweat going, right? To kind of help cultivate the inner fire. So I do like working with the elements as a way of kind of alchemizing that energy.
That
Yeah.
is just, my mind is actually blown. It's so simple, but so profound in the same way. And I've never heard that with the elements. So that is
Yeah.
Yeah.
so great.
Yeah, I think so. Some of that is things that we almost like intuitively do. I shared on
Yeah.
a recent episode, I was just kind of going through just like I don't know, I'll call it a bad day, but like some depression and anxiety, and I was just not feeling myself, and just went and sat in the shower,
Yeah.
and just feeling the water kind of flow over me. Like it helped to clear that out. And I think it is one of those things that maybe we do intuitively know, but we might, like you're saying
Yeah.
before, we get too in the head and want a complicated answer
Yeah. A lot of
to
people
something that might
do
be
it
simple.
unconsciously
Mhm.
as well. Like, for example, a lot of people who say eat a lot of food when they're anxious, right?
Mhm.
Food is the earth element, right? So
Oh.
food actually grounds you,
Oh.
right? This is
Yeah.
why, a lot of people, when they've had a stressful day, they come home and they just eat a lot more than their body actually needs because they're actually grounding their energy. Also, when someone's really stressed out, their cortisol levels are high. They usually eat a lot of carbohydrates, which spikes insulin. Insulin lowers cortisol.
Mm.
So they're actually unconsciously always trying to balance themselves out. You see a lot of people, spend a bunch of time on social media, on devices. That's all the air element, right? It's literally called the cloud, right?
Mhm.
Which
Mhm.
is, the air element. And then afterwards, people feel very ungrounded. They usually gravitate to the kitchen to eat something. They're like, okay, that was the air. Now I need the earth. Now I need to come back into myself. Right. So
Wow.
most people are unconsciously doing this, but we
Mhm.
can actually do it more consciously.
Yeah, and make better choices around it, where
Yeah,
you're not stuffing your face and spending all day on
exactly.
social media.
Exactly.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by this.
Yeah. Like I know our listeners are gonna love it, but like I am loving it. This is the power of social media. I mean, it's wonderful because it brings people together like this, and I'm so grateful for it because it's how the universe
Absolutely.
is working through you and through us to bring these messages and awareness to what needs to
Yeah.
come to light.
Absolutely. As long as we're all in right relationship with it.
Yeah,
Yes,
exactly.
that is
Yeah.
a huge yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like while we're on this, I don't mean to
Yeah,
cut you off.
no.
And while we're on this topic of like anxiety and stress, I feel like it does seem to be something that is becoming more and more prevalent in our society. And I would say probably especially over the past few years when the world has been pretty strange. But yeah, like, can we get into maybe some of the some behavior, like beliefs and behaviors and lifestyle aspects that might be contributing to this? And are you seeing that it is on the rise, or am I just
Yeah.
in
No,
a
I think
bubble making that up?
I think it's pretty obvious that levels of anxiety, depression, like all of that is like all-time high. So the question is why? I think there's a lot of variables. The first of which is kind of like this idea of an evolutionary mismatch, right? We're living very much an evolutionary mismatch, which is our biology is not really in harmony with the environment,
Mhm.
right? So our environments, the technology, the devices, the electromagnetics, all of that has evolved much faster than our own biology has. So there's a mismatch between our own biology and physiology and the environment that it's in now compared to, let's say, 50, 100 years ago.
Mhm.
That could be the electromagnetics, that could be environmental toxicity, that could be the food systems, right? There's so many variables.
Yeah.
But that's, I think, like the overarching theme is like this evolutionary mismatch. But if we look at it kind of at a more detailed level, I think there's a few variables. I do think the electromagnetics overall, obviously, like there's many positives, but most people's nervous systems are in a constant state of overstimulation, right? So that's first and foremost, like super overstimulated in the nervous system. And I think the devices and the amount of information that we're consuming on a daily basis, I think there was research a while ago that the amount of information we consume in a day now is more than a lifetime when our ancestors, maybe 100, 200 years ago, were living. Like it's a day to a lifetime. Like that's kind of the ratio that we're at right now. So I think definitely the overstimulation. I would say the food system, like our nutrition, is very poor now compared to, in decades past. I would say the overuse of antibiotics and pesticides and just all of that, like, has really disrupted people's gut health. Yeah. And there's such a huge connection between mental health and gut health with how many like hormones and neurotransmitters are all made in the gut. So that's a huge thing. I also think that people's breathing patterns are very disrupted, and that's due to sedentary living, but a lot of the mask wearing the last couple of years, I think a lot of people have gone to, much more like mouth breathing, chest breathing, just like real like faulty breathing patterns, which triggers that like sympathetic state in the nervous system. I feel like there's so much more, but those are, I would say, like the most important things. I think it's food. I think it's overstimulation. I think it's breathing, environmental issues, just that whole evolutionary mismatch. And also, there's so many more ways to distract yourself nowadays. Indigenously, like if you had a shitty day, like you just sat by the fire and talked it out with your tribe. Like now it's, let me just, tune out on Netflix. Let me just scroll through Instagram. There's so many ways to kind of check out now compared to in the past. So I think that's a huge component, is the ability to avoid yourself is so much easier now.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I wonder, I kind of want to tell you the kid aspect here. I wonder if that, because I'm finding, Dan and I, we don't have children, but we're at the age where a lot of our kids, a lot of our friends have kids, and family members have kids that are older. And I see it in them that they are experiencing lots of stress, and specifically anxiety too. And I guess I wonder if that's ties in, they're, instead of, sitting down and speaking to their parents about it, they're just going on YouTube and endlessly watching, whatever people watch on YouTube these days. That's so interesting, actually, as like a kid's standpoint, because I do think that mental health in children is on the rise. Do you? Yeah.
And none of those emotions go anywhere. Like, no, they're still inside of you. And the mental health issue is really, you could say, the collateral damage of that, right? It's you're avoiding all of this energy that's not being processed inside of you. Well, that energy needs to go somewhere. So for example, take someone with like obsessive compulsive disorder. That's very much like the release valve that is there as a result of all of that internal pressure and energy that has built up for so long out of the avoidance of processing some sort of emotion. And eventually it's kind of like the mental health crisis is kind of like the soda bottle that you shook up, and eventually you have to blow the cap off, right, to release the pressure. The mind is like the pressure valve that's releasing everything that's built up in the body for, however many of years, because it just hasn't been processed.
Absolutely. That makes so much sense. Yeah. And I think that there's an element too where, anybody who's listening to this or anything on the news kind of right now where you're listing, it's environmental, food things, the overstimulation of electronics. It's kind of like, oh my gosh, where do I start if I want to help myself, my kids, my community? And it can get overwhelming. But I think first and foremost, what Dan and I try to convey to either our clients or people, it's like, all you can really do is focus on yourself. Because when you can focus on yourself, whatever tactics that you do to get yourself into, that rest and digest state that's calm, it's going to then in turn help others.
Yes.
But I kind of want to get into that concept about not overcomplicating things.
Yeah. So I kind of mentioned that a little bit before, and I know it's something I've heard you talk about a lot, where I think people are always looking for the complicated solution.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Where a lot of these things, it is a lot simpler. Like, the nervous system is, you can look at it very, very complex, but you can also break it down to pretty simple. It's one or the other kind of thing, where it's I don't know the best way to put that.
Yeah. Our culture has this illusion, which is, and it's very much of the ego, which believes that a complex issue needs a complex solution.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Where
that's why you're here.
A complex issue can have a very simple solution.
Yes, that's exactly what I got.
I think this pandemic has, magnified a lot of where our blind spots are, where we're still kind of believing narratives that are not working anymore. And you see how much our culture gets so addicted to the complexity and overlooks simplicity.
Yeah.
And, that's why, a mutual teacher of ours, Paul Chek, that's why I think Paul is such a powerful teacher, because he's so grounded in the basics.
Yes.
4 doctors, 6 foundation principles, and you can't put the cart before the horse. So, whether someone comes to me with herniated discs or, OCD and schizophrenia, we're still going to start with the 4 doctors. We're still going to start with eating organic food, getting to bed at 10 o'clock, moving your body for, 30 minutes each day, and, taking a look at where the lowest hanging fruit is. I think that's what people really need to take a look at, is take a look at your lifestyle and say, where's the lowest hanging fruit? Or where's the most amount of stress in my life coming from? And kind of like that whole idea of the stress bucket. A lot of people think that the body and our nervous system will compartmentalize stress, right? That's my financial stress, that's my relationship stress. And we think, that's, my over exercising, and that's my, nutrition stress, but those are all separate. But it's no, that all accumulates in your system. So it doesn't matter what you start with, any stressor that you start with and slowly decrease that, whatever that source of stress is, that overall stress load in the stress bucket starts to come down. So that's kind of the holistic view of not compartmentalizing the body, the nervous system, and stress at large. I think that's really where most people need to start, because 90% of disease, I think, is really stress driven.
Yes.
That constant imbalance in that autonomic nervous system. And you don't necessarily need to do incredibly complex things to rebalance that. You just have to reground yourself in the basics.
Yeah, that's great. Could you share maybe some of the basics that I think would be really some practical things people can do to ground themselves? And
yeah, I would say when it comes to diet, I think the most important thing for people when it comes to mental health is managing your blood sugar well. I think when it comes to anxiety, depression, a lot of these mental health issues, poor blood sugar management is one of the most common just underlying causes that people just aren't consciously aware of.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So I always tell people like protein, fat, and fiber. Like if you get like protein, fat, and fiber just in each meal or some variation of that, and obviously limit the processed carbs, the sugar intake, like you're going to be doing pretty well. When it comes to sleep, I think sleep is the most powerful medicine. So
I agree.
getting people's sleep hygiene, most people's sleep hygiene is horrible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're like laying in bed, like staring at their phone. It's terrible. So
Yeah.
when it comes to sleep hygiene, I just give people three things: light, temperature, electricity. Right. So artificial lighting, whether it's, blue light blocking glasses or, turning screens off, having a curfew for that. Then temperature, getting it as cool as possible. And then electricity, whether it's turning your Wi-Fi routers off, having your phone on airplane mode, whatever it might be. Not having like an Alexa like right by your bed, like just basic things like that, just to get your sleep environment. When it comes to movement, I would say the first thing that I take people through is, obviously I do a lot of like assessments and, program design, but just introducing the idea of working in, right? As opposed to working out.
Yeah.
And, whether that's Tai Chi or Qigong or zone exercises in Paul's book, How to Eat, Move, and Be Healthy, but just introducing people to the idea of using breathing and movement as a way of cultivating more of a parasympathetic state, rather than always, breathing and movement must always be like a hard workout. Now, there's a time and a place for that, but people right now really need more restorative movements. And then, programming their workout program intelligently. I always like the idea of what's the minimum effective dose that you need to do to get the desired outcome that you want. And anything more than that is working against you. Right. So working in, and then when it comes to working out, whatever the minimum effective dose is. And then that is also kind of depending on, who the client is. A lot of people with anxiety and OCD and there are a lot of like perfectionists who are usually overdoing things.
Yeah.
Right. So you usually have to like dial those people back a little bit. It's very rare to get those types of people and they're like not doing enough of something. They're usually overdoing it.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm listening. Those people it's harder to get those people to do less than it is the people that aren't doing enough to do more.
Absolutely.
But
well, that's where a lot of those things are like socially approved addictions.
Yeah.
When I was struggling with a lot of anxiety and OCD and things like that, like working out was a huge addiction. I would go to the gym twice a day, sometimes like, at 11, 12 at night. Like it was like a huge avoidance mechanism of whatever process I was experiencing inside of me. So it's very interesting how we have a lot of like these socially approved addictions that we overlook and not realize that there's something really healthy that you're doing, but you're turning it into a hiding spot. Whether it's like exercise or whether it's eating perfectly and like not willing to like, go out to a restaurant and meet up with friends because, the food there was not like blessed by the Dalai Lama. And like, there's so many hiding spots, even like in the holistic health world. I've even looked at like where for me, like meditation is a hiding spot of like avoiding actual engagement and relationship and maybe like avoiding challenging conversations. Anything, even these, beautiful practices can be hiding spots if we're not in right relationship with them. It's not just the social media that, we use to check out.
Definitely. Yeah. You said that perfectly. They can get dogmatic to a point.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Could we almost like slow it down a little bit to explain a little bit? You're talking about the nervous system and the sympathetic versus parasympathetic, and sort of the role that plays. And you also talked a little bit about stress, but I'd love to touch on the difference between like acute stress and chronic stress. Sure. And how that affects our nervous system, and then the effects that has. I know it's a lot, but I feel like you can handle it.
So we have the autonomic nervous system, which is really built in for our survival. And that's something to understand, which is your nervous system is still wired for survival, just like we were still living out in nature, like as hunters and gatherers. So anytime you trigger a sympathetic fight or flight state, which is the one branch of the nervous system, you immediately shift into survival mode. And the other branch being the parasympathetic, which is the rest and digest state. So what's important for people to understand is anytime you go into that sympathetic state, you're always going back to old programs. You're always going back to doing what you've always done, believing what you've always believed, going back to whatever kept you alive until now. You will always revert back to that. And also understanding that whenever you create a stress response, no matter where that stress is coming from, you're going to be perceiving your reality through the lens of survival. Mm-hmm. Right? So for example, if you ate too much carbohydrates and sugar for breakfast, and now you're on this blood sugar roller coaster, and your blood sugar dips and you have this huge dump of cortisol, that's a huge stress response in the body. You're going to perceive your reality through the lens of stress and survival, but a lot of times people aren't aware that, oh, this is low blood sugar, this stress is coming internally, this is coming from my body. So we look into our outer environment as to, where is the stress? Is it in my relationship? Is it in my work? Is it in my bank account? So we're always projecting outward, like the stress must be something outside of me, not realizing that it might be just a shift in your physiology.
Yes.
Right?
Wow.
So the autonomic nervous system really creates the lens that you perceive your whole reality through. And that's why, what we talked about earlier is the body doesn't compartmentalize any of that. That's why it's so important for example, like your diet or your sleep or, the electromagnetics, all of that plays a huge role in whatever symptomology you're experiencing. Mm-hmm. Also, when it comes to acute and chronic stress, a lot of times, like the anxiety we were talking about earlier, a lot of times we experience chronic stress out of the avoidance of acute stress. Mm-hmm. Right? For example, anxiety, let's say, is the avoidance of something deeper that's more uncomfortable, whether it's fear, shame, or something that feels stressful in like a short period of time. The avoidance of that is what creates the long-term stress, right? Yes. So that's where there's also a lot of value in exposing yourself to acute stressors, whether it's exercise, sauna, breath work, cold therapies, ice bath, like things like that. Mm-hmm. They're so valuable because they build your tolerance and your ability to navigate acute discomfort.
Yeah.
And all of that on a physiological level always translates into the other areas of your life.
Yeah, that's really helpful.
Yeah.
Would you consider like asking yourself difficult questions to be along the same lines as all those other hormetic stresses, like, sauna or cold or exercise, where it's like just like I like to do journaling and just like really dig deep on something, write about it for a page, and then you can kind of stop and close the journal and it's over. And I think of that in the kind of the same sense as an acute stressor and like getting better at dealing with emotions.
Absolutely. I think a lot of our stress is built out of various avoidant tactics.
Mhm.
So asking yourself, for example, a challenging question, the saboteur archetype, for example, in Caroline Miss's teachings, Caroline says the saboteur is the archetype that protects you from a truth that feels inconvenient.
Oh, yeah.
So journaling like a tough question, in some aspect of your life that you're afraid of looking, and some aspect of your life that you're afraid to look at, like that's a huge thing, because so much of our self-sabotage is out of the avoidance of some truth. I've worked with a ton of clients who have a lot of food addictions, for example, sugar addictions, Diet Coke, like whatever. And if you ask them, like, okay, if there's patterns of self-sabotage here, what would happen if you actually transformed into the most empowered version of yourself? Like, where in your life is there now a mismatch? Well, they'll say, well, I hate my job. I really don't enjoy the work I'm doing. So we might explore, okay, well, if you really stepped into the most empowered version of yourself, you could see there's a mismatch of taking impeccable care of yourself and feeling empowered in that regard, and then going to a day job that you like absolutely hate. Right? So you could say the saboteur is protecting you from the truth, the inconvenient truth that you need to look for a new career.
Yeah.
Right. Or it might be, this relationship isn't working, so I'm sabotaging in some area of my life to avoid that truth. So when you said journaling challenging questions, that's the first thing that kind of came up for me, was how we protect ourselves from certain truths that we don't really want to come face to face with.
Yeah. I feel like that's the epitome of like living a deep life, asking all those really difficult questions. Because I avoided it for years, and I still do in certain areas, of course, because like there's only so much shedding of the mask I can do at a time. But it's really like nothing has to happen all at once. Like I was saying before, it's just one little thing that you can dig deeper on, or change, or have that introspection inwards. It's in my experience, I should really just speak for myself. It is so liberating, even though I might feel really uncomfortable for an hour or two, and it's like miserable. And yes, I'm sitting in the fetal position in the corner, but then I feel so much better in the days to come. And it's not a spiral where it's going to take me, 5 or 10 days to get out of. It's that. So thank you for that, because that's I was going to
jump in. That's like a similar feeling to also like whether like if you're doing cold water therapy and you're going to go sit in an ice bath for 5 minutes. It's the same kind of thing where it sucks and you don't want to do it, and then you get out and you feel amazing. And there's this like you get this like rush, or like a tough workout is kind of the same thing where there'll be some like there's a circuit that I have to do next. I don't want to do this. I don't want to do this. But then you do it and you're grateful that you did it. And then the stress is over. And I think it's kind of the same kind of concept. I think it's really interesting that you brought up self-sabotage when I said that, because that's something that I've always struggled with. And what I do, like journaling like that, really does help me with self-sabotage. So I think it's an interesting point or thought that you had there.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is going to sound kind of like esoteric, but I'll explain it like in very simple terms, which is all human suffering only exists within the framework of time. Right? So this is why the shamans would always say, if you want to heal, step outside of time. Right? So if you take, for example, the ice bath, you're going into the ice bath for 5 minutes. And then after 5 minutes, you're going to get out, which is why there's a little bit more of a willingness to go in. The ego believes, if I let this uncomfortable emotion in, I don't know how long I'm going to be experiencing it. Is it 5 minutes, 5 hours, 5 years? So the ego has this idea of time of, if I allow this discomfort in, if it's not set like an ice bath or a workout or whatever, if it's something more internal, something more emotional, something more, thought or emotion based, the ego will always put up a resistance to it because of its perception of time. Right? Where if you told the ego, like, hey, you're going to feel this grief for like 7 minutes, or maybe even like 7 days, and then it's going to be gone forever. Your ego would be like, all right, whatever, no big deal. Right?
Yeah.
But the fact that like the amount of time that you're going to be in an experience is unknown, that's where a lot of the stress actually comes from.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Wow. Oh my gosh.
Which is why one of Buddha's first teachings is the law of impermanence, right? That's why he taught the law of impermanence, which is whatever it is, this too shall pass, right? So one of the reasons he taught that is the alleviating of suffering is started by the acknowledgement of impermanence, right? But the ego structure has a hard time really seeing that. It's like, oh, if I'm going to feel this, then, oh my gosh, this is it. Like, I'm going to be feeling this forever, right? It's all time related.
Wow.
Yeah. I love that you brought that up. That's so fascinating. My gosh. I feel like we could have this conversation for hours and hours, as the ego would put it. But I mean, Greg, we cannot thank you enough. I mean, I have taken so much out of this and am just forever grateful for what you have brought to the table and shown to light. And I cannot wait to release this episode to our listeners. Thank you so much. Where can people find you or follow you? Because everyone should. You are such an amazing, person and wealth of knowledge. So where can people find Greg Schmaus? So
the best place to find me is healing4d.com.
Fabulous.
That's healing the number 4d.com. So that's kind of like my home base with, my one-on-one coaching, podcast appearances, programs, all of that. My 21-day online program, which is Healing the Mind, A Journey to Wholeness. They can go to healing4d.com/HTM.
Great.
That's my Healing the Mind program. And then on Instagram, it's 4D _healing. So 4D healing. And then I just started a YouTube page like maybe 2 months ago, which is just my name, Greg Schmaus. So Instagram and YouTube are kind of like the two social medias that I usually post pretty regularly.
Awesome.
Yeah, you can link to those.
Everything will be in the show notes. Greg, again, it has been such a pleasure having you on. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.